So,
hello, everyone. It's good to see you all here today, particularly because this is about the first in-person event that we've had in 2 years. Yeah, and the first Warburg lecture we've had in several years. So it's especially nice that we're able to see you all today. Many people, however, are on Zoom, and so that's a very good thing because people who couldn't make it are watching on Zoom as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Doherty, and I have the privilege of being the Warburg professor here at Simmons this year. And I'm here really thanks to the generosity of an alumna 39 years ago, Joan Melber Warburg, who 39 years ago very generously endowed a chair in international relations here at Simmons with the intent of bringing in practitioners from a variety of backgrounds from several different countries over the years to work with students, primarily undergraduate students here at Simmons, and bring a little bit of the world to Simmons and Simmons a little bit to the rest of the world. Two of my predecessors are actually watching on Zoom today, one from New Hampshire and one from Washington, DC. And it's nice to have them with us as well. As I said, we haven't had one since Ambassador Bellamy left in 2019. And so it's especially nice that we're able to have it today. When we looked and got permission, first of all, to do something live and in person, the subject area was very, very interesting. I mean, and easy for us to choose. Everyone has Ukraine and Russia at the forefront of their mind right now. But we were particularly lucky here at Simmons that the stars aligned in the way that we did. First, we got permission to bring somebody onto campus, which is the intent of the Warburg program in the first place, after a long period of time due to COVID. Second, we were able to get about the best person that we could possibly imagine to talk about Ukraine and Russia. And I'm not going to do the full introduction because someone else is of our speaker today. Aside of saying what you already know, that we have one of the world's leading experts in this area. Many of you I know just from the flyers that we sent out said, oh, I think I saw her on CNN or heard her on NPR. But the third thing that was really very interesting, and to my knowledge, it's the first time this has ever happened. There's a unusual, coincidental connection with Warburg itself. Dr. Vacroux, when she spent 14 years or 12 years in Russia in 1992 until 2004. Yeah, I'm not doing the introduction. Lauren is, and she'll know that. But among other things that she did in Russia was she served as a partner at the Brunswick Warburg Investment Bank. So I'd like to say that we picked her particularly because we knew of this Warburg connection, but I do think it's a better example of stars aligning. That branch of the bank was actually established by the uncle of James Warburg, who was Joan Warburg's husband. Want to thank everybody that's tuning in by Zoom today. And just one housekeeping thing with questions. Mackenzie Reimer will be monitoring the questions and answers. As it's a webinar format, just send your questions in, but we'll be giving priority at the beginning to those of you here with us. And we have hand mics so that everyone can hear your questions as well. Want to thank Mackenzie and Kevin for their great organization in getting this done. And I mentioned that I wasn't going to do the formal introduction of our speaker, except to say that we're very, very pleased to have her. Joan Warburg's vision for the endowed chair that she funded here at Warburg was to have students interact on an international and a global stage. So we thought this year that it would be very fitting to choose one of our outstanding seniors in international relations. And with no further ado, I'm going to pass it to Lauren Howard.
sorry, the people on Zoom couldn't hear. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexandra Vacroux, the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. After receiving her undergraduate degree from Tufts, she started working on her PhD in government at Harvard. In 1992, she traveled to Russia to research her dissertation on corruption in Russian pharmaceutical markets. She originally intended to stay in Moscow for 6 months, but ended up staying for more than a decade. She began working as a consultant for the Russian Privatization Agency, where she worked in part as a liaison between the legislative and executive branches of the city of Perm. She later worked at United Way Moscow to help expand the capacity of local social welfare organizations. During her time in Moscow, she was also affiliated with the Center for Economic and Financial Research and served in the Brunswick-Warwick Investment Bank. After returning to the US, Dr. Vacroux was a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars before joining the Davis Center in 2010. She enjoys quilting and gardening in her spare time. Please join me in welcoming the amazing Professor Vacroux.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Tom, for those very nice introductory words. Oh, this is going to be in the way. Click. So please let me know if you can't hear me for some reason, especially those who are watching on the webinar. But I want to divide my talk into 3 parts. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Because if you don't understand how they came together in the Soviet Union and how they fell apart when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's very difficult to understand where we are now. Second, I'm going to talk about what's happening now. And by now, I mean since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, and how that has built up to the war that we've seen since February 24th. And then in the last part of the talk, I'm going to have a little bit more of an analytical framework and try and get at what it is that Putin wants to get out of this war, what Ukraine wants, and what it is that the US is doing and perhaps should be doing. And I, of course, look forward to having your questions afterwards. So let me start with the past. And the clicker. You might have to manually advance it.
If you can try.
Okay, so this is, I don't want to say the good old days, this is the Soviet Union. And as you'll see, it was a country that was extremely large. It's still extremely large. It was about 13 time zones across, 6,000 miles. And to just give you an idea, that's about 2.5 times the United States. So 11 time zones from Moscow to Vladivostok in the Far East, and therefore quite difficult to control, right? Nonetheless, Russia wanted to have a series of satellite countries around it. And so after the Bolshevik Revolution, they incorporated these 15 colored countries around, 14 colored countries around. So in the south, we have the 5 Central Asian countries, the so-called stands. Then we have here the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. And then up there we have the Baltics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. And I'm actually going to zero in a little bit on that section because that's what we've been interested in during the war. So here you can see a little bit the remains of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine here looks quite modest considering how large it is. Right, I'll show you a map a little bit later. If you superimpose Ukraine on the United States, it would basically spread from New York to Chicago, right? 44 million people. And what's important about that is that Russia is only 140 million people. So this is not an enormous Soviet Union taking over a tiny country. This is a country, Russia, trying to swallow another country that's about 1/3 of its size. You see Belarus to the north, which is the friendliest government as far as Moscow is concerned. It's been participating in the war by allowing staging of troops. And to the north of Belarus, you see the Baltics. And the Baltics were occupied by the Soviet Union after World War II, never recognized by the West, not dissimilar to, say, Crimea. But as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, they were the first to separate and make a beeline for NATO and the European Union, where they have been. So NATO starts in the Baltics up there. And that's going to be quite important for our story later on. During the Cold War, the world was separated into East and West, at least the European world. So you have the Soviet Union in that mustardy color, And it had a series of friendly countries, the Eastern European countries around it as a belt. This was part of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance that was meant to counter NATO and the West, which are all of these olive green countries, plus the neutral ones, Austria and Switzerland. And you can see that the West ended at West Germany and the Berlin Wall between East and West Germany. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, however, NATO began to expand, and it did so in a series of waves. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether the Russians knew that NATO planned to expand. And the revisionist view of 1990s is that the United States, and specifically James Baker, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch east of Germany. And it now appears that that was indeed something that Baker floated in a private conversation with Gorbachev. Apparently this was his style. He would float different ideas, and then the ones that seemed to have traction, he would follow up on. And he never followed up on this. And in fact, during the first wave of expansion in 1990, all the way through the wave in 1999, the Russians weren't necessarily happy about NATO expansion, but they weren't particularly, they weren't in a strong position and able to stand up for it. Their economy was quite weak. Yeltsin was more interested in keeping the country together domestically. There were secessionist movements in Chechnya, for example, and they just didn't have the energy to focus on NATO. That really started changing with the war in Serbia and the bombing of Serbia over the Kosovars. And that in some ways for the Russians is the original sin that we then allowed for a small section of the country of Serbia to use self-determination as a way to break away and get the world to recognize its independence. And this argument comes back to haunt us when the Russians explain what they did in Crimea in 2014. So NATO expansion is very important in the Russian imagination. I'm not saying that they're right to be particularly concerned about it. I don't think anyone would think that NATO had plans to attack Russia, but in the Russian imagination, it's an aggressive alliance. It does exist just to counter Russia. And so it was potentially a problem for them, a problem that was not recognized as being problematic. So this wave of NATO enlargement moves the line, the border between East and West, 600 miles closer to Russia, which is their concern. Now imagine that Ukraine also joins, that's another 600 miles closer to Russia, and Finland and Sweden are talking about Finland and Sweden are now also talking about joining NATO. So if one of the justifications that Putin has for invading Ukraine is to make sure that NATO stays further away from his borders, that does not look like it's been successful, right? The border, if anything, is now moving closer to Russia. All right, let's talk about the present and what's happened. And as promised, the present starts in 2014. This is a map of Ukraine. You can see this is a very map-heavy talk, but there are good reasons for it. So this is a map of Ukraine that focuses on the population's native language. Now, you can see that the country was roughly divided in what we call overlapping cleavages. So in general, and I'm speaking very broadly here, the western part of Ukraine, which was part of Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is Catholic, is primarily Ukrainian speaking. The east of the country, which was part of the Russian Empire, which is Russian Orthodox, and which is primarily Russian speaking, was on the other side of the Dnepr River. These differences were quite important until 2014 because the voters were split roughly evenly. And so every time there was a presidential election, the voters chose first a pro-Russian president, then a pro-Western president, then another pro-Russian president, and there was kind of a balance between the East and the West. That changed in 2014. The president at the time was Yanukovych, who was a Russian promoted figure, and there were a lot of protests in the main square in Kiev, the Maidan, because the population, at least the population that was protesting, wanted to join the EU. And there was an agreement that Yanukovych was going to sign and then backed out of. People took to the street, and eventually Yanukovych sent in the special forces to shoot at them. and killed about 100 of those protesters. This further increased the demonstrations, and he eventually fled to Russia. Russia called this a coup, said that Nazis were running all over Kiev and taking over the government, and responded by saying that it had to protect the Russian-speaking populations. And this was not totally unjustified, because one of the first things that the new government did after Yanukovych fled was to pass laws saying that only Ukrainian was going to be recognized as the national language, not Russian. This was, in retrospect, a pretty serious mistake. But how did the Russians react? The first thing they did is they took over Crimea. Now, this wasn't as difficult as you might think, because there was an enormous Russian military base that was leasing space in Sevastopol. This is where the Black Sea Fleet was based. And so the Russians managed to send in troops without insignia, without any of the flashes identifying them, and they managed to take over Crimea without firing a shot. The population was mostly Russian speaking. There was a fake referendum where they agreed to join Russia, but probably most of them would have been perfectly happy to join Russia. And Crimea has a special history because it actually used to be part of Russia until General Secretary Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine as a gift in 1954. So Crimea was a special situation. Once that had gone down, the Russians decided maybe they could foster some more separatist movements along that southern and eastern coast. So Odessa, Kherson, Nikolaev, Zaporozhye, Mariupol, which we've now all been following, Donetsk and Luhansk. And they encouraged some of the pro-Russian politicians there to take over administration buildings and try and seize power in those regions, each of those regions being roughly what we would consider a state in the US. Now, this failed pretty miserably in most of those southern cities and worked only in Donetsk and Luhansk, where indeed the separatists managed to take over the local government and to control a certain amount of territory. Not the entire state, which you see still there's purple around the orange, but at least the capital cities. And then you had a civil war. For the past 8 years, you've had a civil war along the line of contact, which is along that orange and purple line, where 14,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives trying to reclaim that territory. That territory is, as far as we know, a hotbed of corruption, lawlessness, smuggling, let's say no rule of law. The Russians have passed out passports, which gives them then the pretense that they're defending their citizens if they need to go in and protect the area. And the reason that this whole area is quite important is that this was the justification for invading Ukraine. The day before the invasion, on February 23rd, the Russian Duma, the parliament, voted to give Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, those states, the entire states, independence. Supposedly they had asked for it, but as you can see, they weren't even under the full control of the separatists. So this was the pretense for moving in. Next slide, please. And Russia had been massing troops and materiel around 3 sides of Ukraine since the previous April. They had done a military exercise, and then they sent those troops home and they left the materiel behind. And then starting in November, you'll probably remember, there was a drumbeat of American intelligence releasing maps showing that the Russians were once again massing troops. And people thought that there was going to be an invasion. At least Americans were saying that there was an invasion. The Russians were saying that they were just being hysterical. The Ukrainians also weren't particularly convinced. And the reason that there was doubt is that there were 200 troops eventually massed around Ukraine, but it's a country of 44 million people. You can't take over a country of 44 million people with 200,000 troops, especially if they're spread out all along this very long border. Nonetheless, to some collective surprise, Russia did end up invading from 3 sides. Now, we were following very closely what was happening in Kiev, in part because those troops passed through Chernobyl, took it over, dug trenches, got radiated, and are now apparently dying back in Belarus from where they've been withdrawn. Nobody told them that they weren't supposed to dig in the Red Forest, apparently. In the other part next to Russia, there were some terrible battles in Kharkiv, in Sumy, for example, but eventually the Russians were pushed out. Next slide, please. So this is as of this morning. The Russians now have reconcentrated and repositioned themselves in the south and in the east. So the purple areas, you're now familiar with those. Those are the ones that were already held by the Russians. And then the red territories are the ones that the Russians are concentrating on and where they are fighting. But I want to caution you not to really believe all the maps, even though I love them, because this map doesn't really tell you the story. In fact, in some ways, this map feeds the Russian narrative. Next slide, please. What's really happening on the ground looks more like this. So those maps that we see show us as far as the Russians have gone, but they make you assume that the Russians control all of the territory behind that edge. And that is in fact not the case. So we need to be quite careful when we're thinking about what the Russians have done. And before we think, the Ukrainians definitely should trade that southern territory in exchange for peace. It's not clear that they have to change to trade that. They're not going to be able to push out the Russians, but nor have the Russians completely taken over that part of the country. The things that the maps also don't tell us is what's actually happening on the ground, right? They don't tell us about the war crimes that were committed in Bucha. They don't tell us about the booby traps that have been left behind in people's kitchens as the Russians moved out. They don't tell us about the destruction of almost all of the infrastructure in these cities. They also, at least those other maps, don't tell us about the refugee crisis. There's an enormous humanitarian crisis building, not only in Ukraine, where there are about 6 million internally displaced people, but all of the people who are leaving Ukraine. It's primarily women and children, because men between the age of 18 and 60 have to stay in order to defend their country. And so you have women and children moving in enormous numbers, primarily to Poland, which has been extremely good about receiving them, to our collective surprise. Also to Moldova, which has received about 400,000 refugees. Now that doesn't seem a lot compared to the other numbers, except Moldova is the poorest country in Europe, right? Moldova can barely feed itself, let alone an additional 400,000 people. So when we think about how we can help Ukraine, it's not just about helping the military and what's going on inside the country, but it's also making sure that there's enough humanitarian assistance going to all of the people who are displaced and who need help. So what do we think Putin is thinking? What do we think that he wants? So he wants to keep control of Ukraine. And the reason it appears is that he doesn't think that it really deserves to be a country. He wrote an article last year in which he explained that it was just a Bolshevik accident that sort of the pencil flew across the map and created Ukraine, where it should have obviously just been part of Russia. Ukrainians, he thinks, are just sort of a subset, little Russians, as they've been known. And their language is sort of inferior to Russia. Their culture is inferior to Russia. They really belong as part of Russia. The Ukrainians, of course, don't see it that way. He also wants to keep NATO far away. He had said that incorporating Ukraine and Georgia into NATO were red lines for Russia. We didn't really take it seriously, but it turns out he meant it. They were red lines for Russia. And one of the arguments that Putin has been making to his own population is that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is an American puppet, and that NATO was preparing to create biological weapons labs in Ukraine and station nuclear weapons right at Russia's doorstep. None of which is true, by the way. But also Putin wants to have respect as a great power. And I'm going to talk in a second about what that means. He wants domestic stability and thinks that the rallying around the flag from a nice little war is going to help him. And he also wants to secure his legacy. So let me talk about those last three in a little bit more detail. What makes a great power great? Well, you need to have a permanent membership on the UN Security Council. Check, Russia has that. You need the ability to project power abroad. That has been a little bit more complicated, but also achieved. And you need some kind of sphere of influence. You need to be able to control the countries around you directly or indirectly. And that's something that even the US thinks that it should have, right? We didn't want to have Russian Soviet missiles in Cuba because we consider Cuba within our sphere of influence. It's not ours, but we still get some say in what happens there. Next slide, please. As far as projecting power abroad, you might remember that Obama had dismissed Russia at some point as being just a regional power. This was a very deep insult. And we believe that one of the reasons that Putin got interested in participating in the Syrian conflict was not only to boost Bashar al-Assad, who's probably only in power because Putin supported him, but also to prove that he could project power not only to his borders, but further away to another country, to the Middle East, where actually they did a pretty good job, not only of shoring up their ally and ruining, let's say, the plans of the United States and the NATO allies, but also of demonstrating weapons, which therefore increased weapon sales for Russia afterwards. In terms of domestic stability, this is a rally that Putin held about 2 weeks after the invasion of Crimea. They're working very hard to explain that, first of all, this is not a war. This is called a special military operation. And it's a special military operation that is supposed to be cleansing Ukraine of Nazis, because Nazis for the Russians are the biggest demons. Right? Remember that Russia lost 25 million people in World War II, and they fear Nazis like nothing else. So when you tell Russians through the media that you control that Nazis have taken over Ukraine and that they shouldn't think that just because he has a Jewish president that there aren't Nazis, they find that quite compelling. Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Jew from Eastern Ukraine, by the way. So he should have been one of the most pro-Russian figures, but it has not worked out that way for Russia. Anyway, so Putin remembers that after he annexed Crimea, his popularity rating went from 60%, which is already stratospheric by American standards, to 80%. And it hovered at 80% for about 3 years afterwards until there were some big corruption scandals. And so it's not out of the, it's not beyond imagining that Putin thought that maybe this would be a good way to boost his popularity a little bit. Why would this be, seem like a reasonable idea? Well, you have to remember that authoritarian governments don't get their legitimacy from being voted into power. Right? So if you can't assume that you won the election and therefore you're the legitimate president, which is the way most democracies worked pretty consistently until a few years ago, you need to have some other reason that people think that you should be in power. And Putin had a sort of social contract that he developed when he came to power. He came in 2000. The 90s had been very difficult, terrible economy. The country was maybe not falling apart, but there was definitely no centralized national control over what was happening in the regions. And Putin came in and said, look, I'm going to reestablish law and order. I'm going to improve your standard of living. And in exchange, trust me, I'm going to run the government the way it needs to be run and with the people that I select. Some of them might get rich, but that's okay because we are going to have a better standard of living and the country is going to be in better shape. And in the 2000s, that worked out pretty well. Oil prices were high, social spending went up, people got to travel, the quality of living improved, much better law and order. It was a pretty good deal. However, when oil prices started to fall, he was no longer able to maintain his side of the social contract. And so the risk was that he was going to lose the legitimacy that allowed him to stay in power. He couldn't count on winning elections as being enough proof that he had a right to continue running the country. And by now, by the way, he's been in power for 22 years, right? So he's been there a long time. And it looks like he and his Kremlin friends devised a new social contract, which is you let me run the country the way I want with the people that I select. And yes, some of them are going to get rich. And in exchange, I'm going to make Russia great again. I'm going to make Russia a great power. People are going to pay attention to us on the world stage. And one of the ways he proved that was by annexing Crimea without a shot. There was an enormous surge in popularity after that. People were tying little ribbons around their antennas. There was joy over Russia's reassertion of its power. I would point out that we are not seeing joy now in Russia. There is support, it looks like, for this special military operation. We don't know how much because there's now no independent media. It's impossible to protest. There's no polling because people are not even, we're supposed to use the word war, so you would never tell a pollster that you objected to it. So people are supportive because they think Russia is under threat and they're afraid of Nazis. But there's not tying ribbons around antennas. And the Zs that we see, that you've probably heard of, this pro-war symbol, is only on government buildings. People are not putting it on their own property, on their clothing, on their cars. Like, it is not sweeping the country in the same way. So he might have miscalculated on that front, not because sanctions are biting yet, they're not, but just because there's not the kind of popular support for invading a country which until the day before the war was being touted as, our brotherly Ukrainian friends. Next slide, please. The other thing that's making people a little suspicious is the possibility that this is actually the vision for Ukraine. This is what the Russians did in Grozny, which was part of Chechnya, actually part of Russia, in order to tamp down the secessionist movement in 1995. They actually fought a second war in 2000 when Putin came to power. This is also pretty much what Aleppo looked like in Syria when the Russians were done with it. It's what Mariupol looks like now, and it's probably what most of southern Ukraine is going to end up looking like. The Russians are not taking over the country in order to make it prosper, right? They are taking it over because they want to control it, and they don't particularly care about controlling the people. They want to hold on to the territory. The other thing that Putin is thinking about is his legacy. So this delicate statue is 60 feet tall. It was actually supposed to be 80 feet tall, but it stands right in front of the Kremlin, and UNESCO said that it was going to dwarf the World Heritage Monument. So it was reduced to 60 meters. And here's Putin. This is I guess, blessing of the statue. It commemorates Vladimir the Great, who is considered to be the founder of Rus, the founder of modern Russia. He was the first prince to unify the Ukrainian and the Russian lands about 1,000 years ago. And interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, he's known as Volodymyr the Great in Ukraine because he's also the founding father of Ukraine. So now we have Vladimir the Great being cited by Vladimir Putin, and you have Volodymyr the Great being cited by Volodymyr Zelensky, a lot of Vladimirs all fighting over the same land and the same territory. But I have no doubt that the reason that Putin had this statue built is because he would very much like in 1,000 years for people to be saying that he also unified Russian lands and Russian and Ukraine lands. And one of the only ways for him to really establish his legacy, it's not really economic growth and restructuring the oil economy and running Russia with his friends the way he wanted to. But if he could reestablish territory and fix this last problem of the 90s, then he would go down in history. And I think that's very important to him. We shouldn't forget, though, that Ukraine also has some desires and legitimate rights to things that Russia objects to. It wants its sovereignty. It wants to control the territory that belongs to Ukraine. It wants the right to choose its allies and alliances, to be part of NATO, if that's what it decides. It wants the end of the civil war in the East, which is expensive and which has also kept it from effectively managing. Zelensky wasn't a great president before the war. And in part, it's because the economy is in catastrophic condition and has been for 20 years. And also, they would like to be members of Europe, part of Europe. And just 10 days ago, Ursula von der Leyen from the EU went to Kiev and gave a special questionnaire. It was in a very fancy envelope to Zelensky saying, here's your application for fast-track admission to the EU. You have 2 weeks. And Zelensky said, we'll get it to you in 1 week. Okay, so maybe they will be part of Europe. Russia, by the way, does not seem to object to them being part of the European Union. They object to NATO. It's the military aspect of it. So this is as promised, just so we remember, Ukraine is not a small country. It's definitely not one that can be easily dismissed. Second largest country in Europe. And it has a president who is not going to go down without a fight. Now, even though historians these days mostly talk about structural factors, like they don't like to focus on the great man version of history, where it's the decisions of one man or woman that makes the difference. They focus on the economy and the geopolitics and all this sort of thing. There seems to be a consensus that the only reason Ukraine is still independent is because Volodymyr Zelensky did not leave the country when the US offered him a ride. Right? He has really rallied the population. He seems to, if not be determining the military strategy, supporting the right people who are determining the military strategy. And he's definitely the leader that Ukraine needed at this moment. So what else have we done in terms of response? The NATO response has been to send troops to position more troops along these East European countries. So remember, these were the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. They are now NATO members, and they are now getting more and more NATO troops. Also, they're serving as the staging ground for equipment that's going into Ukraine. So the way that it's working is that it's going usually to Poland or to Slovakia, to the border, and then the Ukrainians are taking it. So if, God forbid, some of those convoys are bombed, they're not bombing NATO troops, but it's the Ukrainians, which would prevent us from accidentally stumbling into World War III. Also, because I love maps, this is a map of NATO intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights. They are being done. This was the past week. You can see that they're basically flying up and down the border, keeping track of where the Russians are, and just making sure that nothing is, that the Russians know that NATO is right next door. The other thing that's happened is that we have imposed all sorts of different financial sanctions. So we've cut off Russian banks from the dollar. This is particularly important because 85% of global transactions go through the dollar, even if it's people, let's say in Germany, buying something from Japan. If their banks are using correspondent banks in New York, then that transaction hits the dollar at some point in the middle. And if you can't use the dollar, you can't do global transactions. Also, we've banned the sale of all sorts of US-made avionics, chips, semiconductors, and that has had an enormous impact on Russian manufacturing. I'll show you a picture in a second. Airspace has been closed to Russian planes. Very inconvenient if you can't fly over Europe or the United States. 33 countries now won't let Russian planes fly over their space. And also there have been sanctions on oligarchs and elites. So in terms of the sanctions on the bank, why is this important? Well, Russia had amassed an enormous rainy day fund of $650 billion. They knew that sanctions were going to come if they invaded Ukraine. And they thought as long as they had these reserves, they would be able to ride it out. But these reserves are not sitting, in bags of cash in the basement of the Kremlin. They're sitting mostly in other banks, in other countries, in other currencies. So the reserves that are in China, no problem. They can probably still get access to that. Reserves that are in gold, let's say that is in the basement of the Kremlin, that's probably more or less okay. But as you can see, there's a lot of those reserves that were in Western banks, and those have now been completely frozen. So instead of having a rainy day fund of $640 billion, they probably have closer to $180 billion, which is not bad, but it's not enough to last for years and years. The second thing that's important is the banning of chips is having enormous effects on the Russian economy. So Russians manufacture things like cars, but they manufacture them from imported parts. And now they can't buy those parts and those chips, and shipping companies like Maersk will no longer pick up or drop off containers in Russia. So that means that even Uralvagonzavod, which makes tanks, has had to stop working because they no longer have the computers, right? The chips to run the tanks. I mean, a tank is basically a set of computers on treads. And if you don't have the chips, you can't build the tanks or the cars. So we have not only the foreign companies that self-sanctioned themselves and left, like McDonald's and IKEA and everyone else. And that's not a small number of employees, right? McDonald's alone had 62,000 employees in Russia. So those employees and their families are immediately impacted. But now we have basic Russian manufacturing that's also impacted because they just don't have the parts they need to continue manufacturing. And so we're going to see very big pressure on unemployment in the coming months or so. Again, it hasn't been yet because they're still getting paid even if they're not working. But once that stops, we are going to see bigger problems. In terms of the airspace, so Russia had some 40 diplomats kicked out of various embassies accused of spying, including Athens and Spain. And in order to go get them, the planes had to take these enormous detours because they can't fly over Europe. Right, so it was actually a 7,000 kilometer trip instead of 3,000 kilometers to go pick them up. It's not going to be a huge problem, though, because Russian planes are also not going to be able to continue flying. They confiscated 500 planes that were on Russian territory because they just didn't let them fly off and said they were going to keep them. So now, because the Russians have broken the terms of the lease, they're no longer insured. You can't really fly a plane without insurance, but it's not a problem because they also have no spare parts. So unless they cannibalize the planes they have to keep a certain small number flying, they're going to not be able to have domestic air travel either. And then in terms of the oligarchs, this is a bit gratuitous, I admit. So this is Peskov, Putin's spokesperson Lavrov, the foreign minister, a yacht. We've all seen those yacht pictures confiscated. And this is an oligarch sitting in his London estate next to a Henry Moore statue. He's very upset because he has to live on $2,000 a week, and he's not even sure he can afford his cleaner anymore. And this is Elizaveta Peskova, the daughter of the press spokesman, who's extremely upset and thinks it's unfair that she's been sanctioned. All of these guys have been sanctioned. All of the oligarchs has been sanctioned. None of that is going to change Putin's mind. And in fact, none of it would have changed his mind beforehand. Like Putin had decided that it was worth the economic price to take Ukraine. And there was nothing that we could have done differently, at least in terms of economic sanctions, to stop him. So why not do more, right? We're devastated by what we're seeing in Ukraine. It seems immoral not to be doing more. We know that no matter how many weapons we ship to Ukraine, they are not going to be able to beat the Russians. They're not going to be able to push the Russians out of southern Ukraine. And the reason we don't do more, there are a couple of reasons. One is that it's not a vital security interest in the sense that the existence of Ukraine is critical to American survival. Now, we can say that in terms of supporting democracy, supporting allies, of course, it's important that we do something to support Ukraine that's fighting so valiantly for something we believe in. And all of that is true, but it's not Cuba or Mexico, right? It's not something that threatens us directly. And that makes a difference, particularly after pulling out of Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States military is not so keen to go back in and fight someplace that's so far away. Also, we have no NATO treaty obligations. As we're now painfully aware, because Ukraine was never accepted into NATO, the fact that they were invaded did not trigger the Article 5 requirement that other NATO members come to its defense. And there were some security guarantees that were given to Ukraine in 2004 when they gave up their stash of nuclear weapons, which was considerable, but no one seems to think that that's enough of a reason to go in and protect them. And then finally, there's not that much popular support in the US for going in and invading Ukraine. And let's be clear, like even introducing a no-fly zone is basically starting World War III. Right? A no-fly zone means NATO troops or NATO fighters shoot Russian planes out of the sky. Right? That's NATO fighting Russia, which has not happened so far. Also, it means that we would have to take out surface-to-air missile installations in Russia. So now NATO is bombing Russia. Anything that involves NATO fighting directly with Russia is the beginning of World War III. We might decide that we need to go there, right? But that decision hasn't been made yet, and it can't be made lightly for the other reason, which is Russia has nuclear weapons. And it's probably not that hard to imagine a scenario where Putin uses them. Now, we're not talking about ICBMs, strategic nuclear weapons, where they're lobbing them at Chicago, right? Russia has 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, which are small battlefield weapons, smaller than what was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, that you could drop in order to win a battle, right? It's not taking out Kiev or a large city. It's killing hundreds or thousands of people, but not millions of people. And it's a way to get a military advantage. And we're trapped in what political scientists call the stability-instability paradox, which is the nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia had, or the Soviet Union had, for so many years kept us safe, right? There was mutually assured destruction. We weren't going to launch a first strike because we knew Russia would wipe us out, and vice versa. But now the problem is that that very stability is what keeps us from responding in Ukraine, because we think that Putin might escalate and use nuclear weapons. And then we have to ask ourselves, do we respond somehow with a nuclear weapon? Probably not, because we don't really have tactical nuclear weapons. Does that mean, is that the moment that NATO goes in and World War III starts? It's not very far outside of the realm of possibility that we're going to be making those decisions in the next months or so. And the more that we understand about the conflict, the more that we understand the history behind the conflict, the more that we're going to be able to be critical, informed citizen when it comes to supporting or not supporting those decisions. Thank you. Let me just say one more editorial comment, which is you can help, you can do something, right? I was always reminded by my staff not to leave people in total despair. So there's a Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which is devoted to the study of Ukraine, and they have resources on their website for how you can make donations to help Ukrainians. And you can decide, you know, tactical medical gear or weapons or helping refugees. Like there's an enormous list of organizations that are actually involved in helping Ukraine. Right. Sorry, Lauren.
Apologize to me. That was brilliant. Does anybody have any questions right now? Well, I will come to you.
Hi, first of all, thank you. It was very, very interesting. I was reading a report that says US intelligence believes Putin underestimated both Ukrainian resistance and how well the fighting is going in Ukraine. How do you think this will affect him moving forward and both his own personal ego fighting with rules of war and morals? Do you think this could possibly lead to a larger weapon reuse?
So that's a very important question. It does look like the Russians did not really understand what was going on in Ukraine, right? They were totally taken by surprise that it wasn't a cakewalk. You know, their troops that marched in from the north had parade dress in their tanks because they thought they were going to be having a parade in 3 days in Kiev, right? That the Ukrainians were going to collapse, Zelensky was going to flee, they were going to put in a puppet, and the war would be over. And it looks like the reason that this is the case is that after 2014, the industry of Ukraine experts in Russia, which was never particularly big, kind of dissipated because they thought that they got it, right? They invaded Crimea. It all went so well. So it looks like Ukraine really is kind of part of Russia. And for 8 years, they completely failed to notice the development of a Ukrainian nation state. So that division that I was talking about, where you would alternate between Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking politicians, that pretty much disappeared because over those 8 years, Ukrainian identity formed around the idea that Russia had taken part of the territory away, was fomenting a civil war in the East, and was therefore like not even a possible partner. Whereas before it had been seen as a completely viable partner. So the Russians completely missed the changes in Ukrainian politics to the point where, you know, I was part of this working group, an international relations working group, and we would meet with Russian, you know, professor types every 6 months or so. And we always wanted to put the question of Ukraine on the agenda, and they would never put it on the agenda. And finally we said, like, what's the problem? This seems to be one of the biggest issues. And they said, oh, Ukraine is a domestic issue. That's not an international relations issue for people like us. It's an entirely different group of people that take care of it. So they just like forgot to notice that Ukraine was changing and to really anticipate what was happening. It does look like Putin was also getting bad intelligence. So you probably have seen that he has arrested the deputy of the secret services that were responsible for intelligence on Ukraine and a lot of other officers. We don't know if it's because he wasn't getting information or they were giving him false information, or if it's that, like many dictators, eventually like only people who tell them what they want to hear are allowed in their proximity, because anyone who's given bad news is considered to be disloyal. So it could have been that the information was there and was good, but never passed up to the top, or it could have been that he heard it and just didn't believe it. We don't know. In terms of what's going to happen now, I mean, I'm sure that he knows that the war went badly because they underestimated Ukrainian resistance. And it does look like they're going to be concentrating their efforts. They've repositioned their forces in the south and in the east. And you know, we don't know how it affects his psychology, but we do know that, you know, given that he's, you know, for lack of a better term, kind of has the bully's mentality, the worse things go, the more aggressive he becomes. Right? And that's what we're really worried about, that we have not yet seen the worst of what's going to happen in Ukraine.
It seems like the military operation has secured Ukrainian national identity now also. But that wasn't my question. Two questions. One was about the sort of Nazi scare in Russia about the Ukrainians. Does that carry across generations? That was one question. And the other was the Zelensky's offer of neutrality and the impact of that, or will there be any impact of that in your view? And thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the younger generation, I have a slide Please keep going. I think it's the second, no, other way. More? Yes, okay. So children have been manipulated in Russian propaganda for the past 20 years as part of this World War II myth, right? The World War II was a tragedy because Russia and the Soviet Union lost 25 million people, but it was also the moment where the country came together to repel an invader, to repel aggression from the West, and to solidify its national identity. And this idea of the defining moment in Soviet history being World War II is one that's being taught, heavily is not the right word, but extensively in schools, right? So children are taught that Nazis are the worst possible thing that you can imagine, and being encircled by your enemies is extremely dangerous because they can invade you at any time. And I don't know the extent to which they believe it, you know, in the same way that in America, like World War II kind of loses its salience for kids who never lived through a war. But there's no doubt that they get a much higher dose of it than what we give our kids on World War II, for example. So war doesn't seem like an inherently, it's dangerous, but it's not necessarily bad, if you will, because it's a moment for the country to prove itself and to fight. And this is, in a way, it's difficult for us to imagine, right? I mean, we have oceans to our east and to our west, big friendly neighbors to the north and to the south. Like, no one is going to invade the United States, right? But Russia has been continually invaded throughout its history. The Mongols, the Turks, the French, the Swedes, the Turks again. Like, whenever they didn't have this buffer zone or they weren't expanding their territory, they were being invaded. And this is also something that's drummed into Russians from a very early age. We are encircled by enemies. You know, you can't be speaking ill of Russia necessarily, because that's dangerous for national unity. And that's where the fifth column inside the country is going to take advantage of us and weaken us. I mean, it hasn't been that strong under Putin since the Soviet Union collapsed, but it's definitely creeping back there, and it finds some resonance. You know, in the same way that it's difficult for people who believe one thing to then process contradictory information. So, you know, why would the Russians believe that there were Nazis running around in Ukraine when the president is Jewish and like no one has seen a Nazi in 50 years or 70 years? If they've been told that that is the greatest threat and that it's a problem, it's very difficult to convince people that then it's not a problem. So I think there's a certain receptivity, even if the younger generation doesn't buy all of it, they're still part of the movement to support the country and rally around the flag. Now, I suspect that's going to be diminishing over time, as it often does, right? When the soldiers come back and say, yeah, we drove into this village and we told people they were liberating from them, and they were like, from what? Right? And that seems to have been the experience of many of these Russian soldiers. Like, they thought they were going in and actually liberating the villages from Nazis. And they get there and they're like, yeah, you destroyed our Philharmonic, thank you. But we had no Nazis. So it's going to, once those stories get back to the villages and then spread in networks, it's going to be harder to maintain that. But so far, it's a pretty robust front, if you will. What was the second question? Neutrality, right. So this is very interesting. One of the things that Zelensky had talked about before the peace negotiations collapsed was that Ukraine might be willing to forego membership in NATO as long as it could get security guarantees, which are basically equal to what you would get for being a member of NATO, which is that the United States, Russia, France, Poland, a couple other countries would basically promise to defend Ukraine within 3 days if it was invaded. So the Russians, would probably not accept that in the end, but it's interesting that he's willing to offer it, and that might be where one of the compromises is found.
Real quick, we actually do have an online question, which is, would you kindly explain the historical significance of Kievan Rus?
Wow, okay, well, that goes back to Vladimir the Great, right? He is the one who had unified the Kievan principalities and the Russian principalities. And actually, if you keep going, I have another backup map. Keep going. Keep going. Aha, okay. So this is the Russian Empire. And you can see at the top there, these are the different stages of expansion. And again, the area that we're interested in here, you can see that Kiev, I mean, the map is a little bit distorted, but basically Kiev ran down to Tbilisi in Georgia all the way up north to where the Baltics are. And Kievan Rus was actually more important than Muscovy and the Russian territories for a long time. And this is also part of the tension, right? That eventually Moscow comes out on top, the Russians come out on top, but Kiev was, when these two areas were united, was the most powerful of the two governments or of the two principalities. So it's been a slow kind of loss of power for Ukraine, but loss of power should not mean loss of sovereignty. And Russia, of course, as having lost its empire, should also not be thinking that, you know, just because you had an empire once doesn't mean you always have a right to it.
So I think the question that I have is, what do we understand from what happened in Syria in terms of the dynamics in the United States and of the world, in that stability, instability paradox that you talked about? Because the destruction of Syria is pretty devastating, both to the region, folks leaving, as we're seeing people leaving from Ukraine. But there's I feel like there's an obliviousness to that in the United States of sort of what the impact was of not moving in there. And we identify more with Ukraine, but I'm wondering how much of a pattern one can imagine of the Western mentality, at least in the United States, being similar to the disconnect with really the impact of what happened in Syria.
Now, I don't think most Americans know what happened in Syria. And, you know, I think the idea that people only appreciate something when they see it happening to people that look like them, that they can relate to, is definitely at play here. There's no doubt about that. However, I also think that the global risk that Syria posed is much less than what Russia poses, right? So yes, Syria was basically destroyed, right? And left with a dictator who's not going to do it any favors so long as he and his cronies are in power. But it's unlikely that Syria is going to project itself and destroy other countries in the region. It foments terrorism, right? It does plenty of bad things. You know, it's hard to say because it was a civil war, right? And Russia wasn't really fighting. The proxy war would be like Russia fighting the US, but the US wasn't really fighting Russia directly, right? We were fighting different things in Syria, not directly each other, right? The difference here is that we would actually be fighting each other. And it seems a little bit like an academic distinction, but in terms of the military, there's a big difference, right? And so in both Syria and in Ukraine, there's a deconfliction line, which is a phone line between the American military and the Russian military. And every day, even now, like when we're not speaking to the Russians, they call each other and make sure that the line works and that the other side picks up, right? Just in case something bad happens. And the idea is that they're not actually supposed to be fighting each other. And even in Syria, there was that one case where the United States wiped out 200 mercenaries. They had called ahead of time to say that they were going to do this. And because they weren't Russian military, it looks like the Russians didn't care so much. They were mercenaries. But I think this would be a fundamentally different kind of conflict. And that's the way both the United States and the Russians imagine it, in part because, you know, you've got a lot of Russian, let's say, branded equipment that's there, and you would have NATO equipment responding to it. The other question is, like, why hasn't that triggered Russian escalation so far? Right? And the Russians seem to be on the fence about that. There was a démarche that was delivered to the American ambassador in Moscow a couple of days ago that warned the United States to stop arming the Ukrainians. And the way we understood that is that the Russians are beginning to think that maybe they would bomb the convoys of arms, for example, which is why it's important that the Ukrainians take them over as soon as they come into Ukraine, and not having NATO troops bring them all the way to the front. We're also apparently going to be training Ukrainians now in Poland to use certain missile batteries. Like, does that count as United States moving in? I mean, we're getting closer and closer to a direct conflict. And if that's what we're planning on doing, we should tell the Russians, because that's in a way our last chance to get them to believe that something worse is going to happen and potentially react. But I don't think that decision has been made yet.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. I'm curious, because of Russia's status on the as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Do you think they will be held accountable for crimes against humanity and war crimes?
So the precedent is not great in terms of having them being held accountable. They're certainly not going to be held accountable within the Security Council, right? It would be the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is set up to deal with that, and apparently they have investigators on the ground, and the fact that a lot of social media has been used to document what happened is probably helpful. But I don't think that Putin is going to be brought to trial for war crimes, for example. And I don't think that that's going to be how Ukraine is counting on getting satisfaction for this, right? It's going to have to be much more extensive action on the West's part to support Ukraine and to continue withholding support for Russia.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was just wondering, you talked earlier about like the stands. Do you think that the international backlash would have been as great if Russia had chosen to like take back like one of those countries instead versus Ukraine, which is, a European country? And also like along that line, like how do we convince like other countries which like the West has like intervened in to put the same care into the situation when the mindset is kind of, well, no one spoke up when this was being done to us. Like, how do we convince people to, care about this?
I think it's helpful to talk about the problem. When we talk about refugees in a humanitarian crisis, we don't have to talk only about Ukrainians, right? There are still Syrians and people from Lebanon that are also in these countries if they were lucky to make it in, right? Poland has been great with the Ukrainians, but was not great with the Syrians, right? But when we're supporting these refugee agencies and humanitarian assistance, I think it's very important to point out that our concern is for all refugees, not just Ukrainians, right? In part because I think most Ukrainians think that they'll still be able to go back home at some point, whereas probably most Syrians or Afghans are never going home. So it's very important that we keep, the value of humanitarian assistance does not depend on where you come from, right? It's based on where you are now and the help you need in the moment. In terms of whether or not we would have reacted as strongly, let's say, if Russia had invaded Kazakhstan, it's hard to tell, in part because those countries are more authoritarian also. So I think part of the appeal of Ukraine is that they do seem to be fighting for democracy. And that's, of course, been magnified because Zelensky is crushing it on social media, right, compared to the Russians. And I don't know, let's say, if the Kazakhs would have been able to do that. But Kazakhstan is definitely worried. They have been balancing between China and Russia now for 30 years, delicately, because they kind of want Russia to protect them from being annexed by China, but they need Chinese economic investment. It's always been a very dicey issue, particularly because there's a large Russian-speaking population in the north of Kazakhstan. So the fear is that Russia might decide to pass out passports there and then say that they need to defend those populations. So interestingly, what we're seeing now is that those Central Asian countries are kind of backing up slowly from Russia, without making any sudden moves, because they understand that if Putin gets away with this, like there's not that much to stop him from going into their countries. And if the West doesn't move in to save Ukraine, they're certainly not going in to save anyone else.
Alexandra, thank you very, very much. Don't see
I think your mic is off.
What we knew at the time was no matter what happened, there was what title we gave to the program, This is a problem that's not going to go away for some time. There's going to be repercussions that last for a very, very long period of time. So I encourage you to look at the Davis Center website. There's really great information there. But the information that we got was directly from the executive director at the center. We're very honored to have had you here. We have a small Simmons souvenir for you to take back to the other side of the river with you when you go back. And please join me, you and in Zoom land, in thanking Dr. Vacroux very much for being our Warburg.